In this video, I'll be talking about how the Anti-Saloon League was the main reason behind the passing of the 18th Amendment or Prohibition. The reason that I'm interested in this topic is that each year in the U.S. we have around 178,000 deaths due to alcohol use, and to this day, the 18th Amendment is the only amendment that has had a different amendment passed to repeal it. That amendment would be the 21st Amendment, and it was passed in 1933, 14 years later, which makes it done by the same generation that voted in the 18th Amendment. This brings up the question of how the 18th Amendment was allowed to pass in the first place if it was so unpopular that it would be repealed in just 14 years. While many factors played into its passing, the Anti-Saloon League is one of the main forces behind the actual passing of the 18th Amendment. However, it's important to note that during the time period when people were attempting to get the 18th Amendment passed, World War I was also going on, and this was during the Progressive Era. For now, let's talk a little bit more about the Anti-Saloon League. They had more supporters in the South and rural. Their main demographic was also women and Protestant churches because their ideals closely aligned. However, this does not mean that they did not have branches in big cities, and as this picture shows, they did in fact have a branch in places like San Francisco. And the Anti-Saloon League was founded in Ohio, which is in the north. The Anti-Saloon League's main goal was to pass legislation. Originally that was in counties, but they leveled up to states and then eventually to passing amendments. The first step that they did was they would go into churches, mainly Protestant because their ideals aligned more, and they would educate the people there on issues with alcohol. They would pass out flyers that they made because they had their own publishing company. With that publishing company, they also published newspapers. It was titled The American Issue, which, as you can see, was also quoted in the flyer from earlier. Their next step would be to ally with other groups in the area to get the word out. They were nonpartisan, as their sole issue was focused on prohibition and stopping the sale of alcohol, so they did not ally with either Republicans or Democrats, and they worked with many different groups, often on different scales of the spectrum. A well-known group they worked with is the Ku Klux Klan, which might be why we don't hear about the Anti-Saloon League as much anymore, because now that would be seen as a highly negative thing to do, especially in this part of the country. On the other hand, they also worked with groups like the NAACP, which would be considered the opposite side of the spectrum as the Ku Klux Klan. After they got allies, they would once again focus on legislation, trying to secure the votes of people to pass their dry amendments. There were other groups that were working on prohibition, like the Women's Christian Temperance Unit. However, they were less successful than the Anti-Saloon League because they focused on a broader range of topics, including women's rights, and they didn't focus on legislation as much, so they had less of an impact, even though they'd been around since close to the beginning of the prohibition movement, when it was more of a temperance movement and focused on just limiting alcohol. And they also developed into the idea of completely eliminating alcohol and prohibition. However, with their focus on education instead of legislation, they did not have the same impact as the Anti-Saloon League, even if they were allied with them and did help them in some ways. The WCTU, however, does highlight the importance of women in prohibition, as they were one of the main groups fighting for this, since they had been in the beginning. And during this time period, men had a 3-to-1 ratio of excess drinking. And with the start of the Progressive Era and middle-class women taking more of a role as reformers, and in civil rights legislation they were given more power, especially when World War I started and soldiers went away and they got to start taking more jobs, having a larger role. This was not the only impact World War I had on the Prohibition movement. There was a lot of anti-Germanism during this time period because they were fighting Germany, and the Anti-Saloon League and other groups capitalized this because Germans were usually associated with saloons because that's the businesses a lot of German Americans had during this time period. And so a way of being patriotic and countering the Germans was to get rid of saloons because they were associated with the enemy, because this was happening during World War I. This caused many nativists who would probably originally not have backed the Prohibition movement to join it because they saw it as keeping out German influence and a way to fight against Germans and immigrants. The idea wasn't solely centered around associating German Americans with saloons. It was also seen as patriotic to deny yourself something, as a lot of what was going on around that time was saving food so it could be sent to the soldiers, and booze was seen as non-essential, so it could be seen in a patriotic light and as helping your country. Another important factor of World War I is that it took men who likely would have been pro-alcohol and anti-prohibition, and it took them out of the country. So not only could they not influence the people around them who would have been in the U.S., they also would have had a harder time voting, even if they did have the opportunity to do it, as they would have been more focused on the war effort. So not only did it up the influence of women, it also took away the influence of these young men. The funny part about World War I allowing the Anti-Saloon League to gain all this power and these positive effects that allowed them to convince more people to support the Prohibition movement is that before, during the temperance movements in the mid-1800s, the Civil War started and actually shut down the temperance movement completely. But since World War I was outside of the U.S., it actually allowed for more focus on prohibition. However, the Anti-Saloon League did not rely on the changing attitudes toward women or the effects of World War I, as we can see, because they managed to pass the Volstead Act after the 18th Amendment. It was meant to reinforce it after the mobsters had begun running underground pubs and things like that in larger cities, and they managed to pass it even though women had started to return to their more traditional role in society with the ending of World War I and them going back to traditional jobs. And once again, World War I was over, and so the effects of it were definitely diminished at this point, and yet they still managed to pass legislation, which is why it's clear that the Anti-Saloon League was instrumental in the passing of the 18th Amendment. Thanks for watching!